when I get down to it, that's really what it's all about. If I can whet somebody's appetite, make them study it that much more, that's to me, I've done my job. And
absolutely.
And I still love this school, still love Piedmont Road, still love what you've done in times past, and you're helping that. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
I appreciate that.
Well, the timing could be better, Tommy, because where we worship in Thayer, Missouri, the preacher there asked if I wouldn't mind taking the Sunday morning Bible class, and he wants me to teach on Proverbs. So,
really?
Perfect. I said, oh, I've got a few notes.
Well, good.
So,
well, that's great. That's what it's about. You learn it, you got to use it, right?
Sure. And I can say,
you don't use it, you lose it, right?
Well, I can always say too, if somebody disagrees, well, Tommy says.
And they'll say, "Who's Tommy?"
Who's Tommy?
And the longer I live, the more I want to know more of God's word. But the thing is the longer I live, the more I come to the realization that I thought I knew something and didn't. You know what I'm saying? And that's like I said, that's becoming an eye opener for me. That's why I love to teach classes, because of the fact that I do learn a lot more than I would have any other way. Just even doing sermons, you study stuff for sermons, but when you're actually studying books and you're trying to put all this stuff together and teach it, then that's a whole different thing. And it really helps me out. And that's what I want. And I'm wanting to challenge myself all the time. So I know you'll do a great job. And I guess if push come to shove, you could do the YouTube videos up there. So you say, "This is Tommy," and
I'll just introduce you.
Here he is, right back here.
There he is. I never thought about that, but that's a great idea. I'll just make a cameo appearance, then you can do the rest.
There you go. There you go. Anyway, what can there's so much beauty with it comes to this technology, and then at the same time, it's something to come back and get you some way or another. So it is what it is. It is what it is. Let's begin with prayer. I'm grateful, Father, for this day, and I'm grateful for my class. I'm grateful for Mark and how he's always encouraged me as an elder and as a brother in Christ. I pray your richest blessings upon him and his family. I pray, Father, that you please be with all of our students, with Jerome, with Brad, and Brother Joe. I ask you, Father, to please bless them and take care of every one of them and help them all in the struggles and the trials that they're going through. We know, Lord, that you love us more than we can ever possibly imagine, and you've given us your word. And sometimes, Lord, we get things kind of out of kilter a little bit. We don't always look at things the way we need to. Open our eyes, help us to see, help us to understand, help us to grow and be what we need to be. Father, thank you so much for the book of Ecclesiastes, because it reminds us that if we look at things just strictly from the world's viewpoint, we will be without hope. But thank you so much for giving us your Son. And help us to see, Lord, there's more than just this life. Help us to be ready. In Jesus' name, amen. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 emphasizes the idea of the vanity of gain and honor, beginning in verse 8 and going through about verse 17. And as we look at that together, we saw that he talks about some of the problems that come from this. He emphasizes the idea that actually 10 verse 12, chapter 5 verses 10 through 12, he emphasizes that, number one, riches cannot satisfy. Verses 10 through 12, verses 13 through 17, that riches can be harmful. Riches kept for their own, or for their owner to his own hurt. He emphasizes the idea that riches can be enjoyed in verses 18 through 20. And then he goes right back in chapter 6 and begins to talk again about the problems with riches. So we start tonight with chapter 5, verse 18 through 20. And again, it's very quick. We kind of got down to that point, and then we'll go on into chapter 6 tonight. He emphasizes, he said, here's what I've seen. It's good and fitting for a man to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all of his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life which God gives him, for it is his heritage. So here he's emphasizing the idea. Here's the old conclusion. If you look at things under the sun, it's good for a man to enjoy. In fact, it's a very fine thing for men to enjoy the good of our labor from which we toil under the sun. So he urges people to eat and drink and to enjoy it, to make the best of life, enjoy all the good things that God gives them. But again, this labor is toilsome under the sun. He says it's all the days of his life, and that is just part of his heritage. But it is, we engage in labor, but it's God who gives the increase. And again, the labor itself is a product of God's love and care. We also know that God cares for us enough to give us the things that we need. So as every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage, this is the gift of God. So we should not attempt to squeeze out of labor more out of it than what it's capable of delivering. Again, some people, and we know it, we've met those people, they work and work and work and work and work. And then when they can't work anymore, it's just like their life has come to an end. And again, what does he give us this opportunity to work for? For the things of this world that we can sit down and enjoy. And it's truly the gift of God that God gives us that ability to do it. So it's not only the riches, but also the enjoyment of the riches that God gives us. That is a gift from God itself, or God himself. So he says, he will not dwell unduly all the days of his life because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart. And again, if he has that calm enjoyment, material things, he doesn't worry himself about whether it's going to last or the possible trouble of life. He's not worried. Again, we think about Matthew chapter 6, verse 34, where he emphasizes the idea, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient of the day is its own trouble. So we have joy whenever we allow ourselves to enjoy what God has given us under the sun. But it seems like as he's talked about these failings of wealth and the vanity of gain and honor, chapter 5, verses 8 through 17, he talks about all these different things. Now, it's kind of like he picks back up with that same idea. He said, there's an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men, a man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all that he desires, yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, and it is an evil affliction. For it comes, he says, if a man begets 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial, a stillborn child is better than him. For it comes to vanity and departs in darkness, and its name is covered with darkness. And though it has not seen the sun or known anything, this has more rest than that man, even if he lives 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness. Do not all go to one place. So here you have, again, he starts off with this idea, this is what's heavy upon men. This is something that's a burden upon men. What is it? A man that has no enjoyment of what God has given him. And it's interesting to me, and I think it's another one of those ideas that we often think about, that perhaps the best place to have broken that chapter up was not here in chapter, where it starts in chapter 6, verse 1, but that should have continued on in chapter 5, and maybe break it up about verse 7 of chapter 6. So here's a man, again, he works hard, but he has no ability, no chance to enjoy what he has. He has a good reputation, but again, he has wealth and honor, and so everybody knows it, so he lacks nothing for himself, but God does not give him the opportunity to eat of it. And again, I think I briefly mentioned a couple of weeks ago, or maybe last week, the idea of the rich fool in the book of Luke, where he says, today I have everything and I'm going to tear down my barn and build bigger barns. So Notice here's this there. He lacks nothing of all that he desires, and yet he still doesn't enjoy it because he winds up having to give it to somebody else because maybe he dies before he does have the opportunity to enjoy it. All right. So as you look at that, here it is. Here's a man that has no enjoyment. Verse 3, or actually the last part of verse 2, going on into verse 3, is the ideal of a man without an heir. So a rich man has a great deal of wealth. So a calamity strikes. He doesn't have anybody that he can pass it on to. So somebody else gets it. And I often think a lot about that with regards to people and what I've dealt with. I think I've shared with you before that recently I've been dealing with a man that got kicked out of his house, and it was his mother's house. He made some very, very, very tragic mistakes. And when you start sorting through all that stuff, just like with my mom and my dad, when they passed away, you start sorting through all that stuff and you begin to wonder why did they keep this? What was so important about this? And who's enjoying it? And it's not the family even. They're not enjoying anything there. It's all gone. And so he really doesn't enjoy anything. So somebody else is consuming it. And he said, this is vanity. It is useless. And again, that word vanity suggests that idea of uselessness. And it is an evil affliction, or as he would say, and another way to look at it, it's an evil disease. He considers this to be like a disease when a man cannot enjoy what he has the opportunity to, has worked for all of his life. He has no heir, and so possibly he has to surrender that wealth. Maybe think about it this way. It could be because of a war. A foreigner comes in there and steals it. He has nothing. A man without a tomb. If a man begets 100 and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, he has no burial. So again, those who fathered large families in ancient society was considered to be extremely blessed. So here's a man that had lived many years. We remember in Exodus 20, verse 12, that if you obey mother and father, you will have long life. There's that promise, that special blessing. But what? Here's a man who's had a miserable life, and he has an even more miserable death. He has no burial. So as you're looking at this context very closely, it very well could be talking about verse 2 and 3, talking about the situation that happens during wartime. And again, we have seen the pictures coming out from Syria and some of these other places even now, but you go back not too long ago, less than 100 years ago, and look at the pictures in the 40s and the 50s where what happened with all the devastation from World War II. And nobody has nothing, dead bodies laying around. And here we go again. So he says, this baby is better. A stillborn child is better than him. For it comes in vanity and departs in darkness. It doesn't know anything in this world that it needs to be, it doesn't know anything in this world. So it's not like it has really enjoyed anything or had anything as a result of it. And so he then says, verse 6, even if he lives 1,000 years twice, he's not seen goodness. Do not all go to one place. So could the long life of this hypothetical rich man be superior to the one of the miscarried fetus? No. He said, if a guy lives to be 2,000 years old, but he hasn't seen goodness, there's no enjoyment here. And we all go to what? We all go to that one place. And again, in the Hebrew, that was Sheol. In the Greek, it's Hades, the abode of the dead. Both of them wind up there. You can't take your riches with you. Paul would tell Timothy, we brought nothing into this world. We can carry nothing out. So if long life were spent in calm enjoyment, it might be preferable to a short life. But, if you have nothing but care and discontent and annoyance, it's better to begin with nothing and end with nothing. So all of this comes into play. Verses 7 through 9. Now, he's talked a lot about this idea. All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the soul is not satisfied What more has the wise man than the fool? What does the poor man have who knows how to walk before the living? Better in the sight of these eyes than the wandering of desire. This is vanity and grasping for the wind. So he's still dealing with riches here, and he deals with man's desire, okay? All the labor of a man, again, this side of eternity, is for his mouth. To enjoy, for self-preservation, for enjoyment here upon earth. Eating and drinking are kind of looked at here as the figurative of everything that satisfies us. And so here's what he calls, he says, some ethicists, these people that really think a lot about ethics, call this the hedonistic paradox. The more people pursue pleasure, the more elusive pleasure becomes. So it's kind of like a child when he's growing up, and we teach children this. It's kind of like a child that's never happy with what he has, but then we grow up and we're never happy with what we have. We always think about the car that we bought and we're happy with it until we make the first payment, or until something happens to it, the first scratch, and then we're having to make the next 8 years of payments. It seems like nowadays to have to pay for a car like that. And then we have to make the next 8 years of payments and wishing we could have another car. And it's so sad in that respect. We're always wanting something else. Think about this. You think about drugs. It starts off with alcohol, maybe it goes to marijuana, then it goes to heroin, cocaine, meth. And every disappointment leads somebody to try to find something more to get the high hit and the high that they're looking for. Think about all the toys and the trinkets, all the computers, all the iPads, all the iPhones. People stand in line to get the newest iPhone the moment it hits the market and spend $1,000 for the thing, and it doesn't do any more than the one that they had. And so you see this. He said, this soul is not satisfied. And what does a wise man have? Does wisdom help the situation? Okay. Now remember, he's talked a lot about this idea of wisdom. And remember back in chapter 2, verse 15, he says, what happens to the fool happened to me also. Why have I then been so very wise? He says, for the wise as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come, all will have been long forgotten. So think about this from the ideal of worldly wisdom. And this wisdom is always restless. It's never going to be satisfied. It's never going to be content. And he says, what does a wise one have more than the fool? Nothing. Really nothing, as it boils down to it. So he says, what does the poor man have who knows how to walk before the living? Does a prudent poor man have the advantage in respect to the desire than a fool? Here's a man who's living very, even though he's poor, he's living very wisely. He knows how to walk. He's walking down the correct path of life. He's behaving properly. He is doing what he needs to. He's behaving uprightly in his social relationships. But he's learned to accommodate himself to his circumstance. He's making the best of his lot. He says, does he really enjoy life? Which of these two extremes does it really happen? That a man could be so rich and spend everything and still never find the pleasure that he wants? What about the poor man that is prudent, knows how to live his life? Is he really finding what he wants here in this life? And most people fall somewhere in between those two categories. So he says this, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. I like that phrase. It's the idea, it's better what you enjoy what the eyes see than what you're hoping to see somewhere down the line. And that's what he's talking about. He's emphasizing that idea. So again, enjoy the present. But don't have that restless craving that goes on there. Verse 10, some counsel for troubled times. Chapter 6, verse 10 through the 8th chapter, verse 17. Whatever one is, he's been named already, for it's known that he's man. He cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? So here's this, and this is where some people say this is the main second part of the book. This is where the part really starts to break up. We know it's in chapter 12, has 12 chapters, so we would figure that it would break up perhaps somewhere in chapter 6. Here's perhaps where this next big thing is. So again, he's going to make deductions on the experiences he's talked about in the first 6 or first 5.5 chapters. So now he's going to be talking about what happens and what are some things we can deduce from all of this? What are some things that we can learn? All righty? Whatever one is, he has been named already. His name was given long ago. So you think about Genesis 2, verse 7, he named man Adam, Adam, where again, this puts man's name puts him in his proper place. We are above the animals, but nowhere else. We are puny. We don't live very long. Hey, brother. We don't live very long. We don't enjoy a lot of the things that God has given us the opportunity to enjoy. And so here's a man that he's already been named. It is known that he is man. That's what he says in verse 10. He is Adam, Adam. And he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. Now, there are those today that seem to think they can argue with God and fight with God and fuss with God about everything. I'm in Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 10 through 12, brother. And tonight, depending on what happens, we're going to finish up tonight, possibly. All righty? All right. Depending on what happens. All righty? We remember that in Isaiah 45, I believe it is. It's Isaiah. Isaiah asks this question, woe to him who strives with him who formed him, a pot among earthen pots. Does the clay say to him who forms it, what are you making? Or your work has no handles? Do we as men have the right to question God and to question how he's made us and what he's made us for and the purposes that he made us? God has supreme control of everything. He is the one who exalts or brings down men. If he has not willed to give riches to a man, then that man is going to labor in vain to achieve the wealth. Now, that goes against our ideas in the fact that we think if we work hard enough and labor hard enough and do all the right things, we will what? We will reap what we sow, and we will be able to be rich in that respect. But sometimes, and you know this will be the case as well as I do, there have been those that have done everything right and still wind up broke. So that's man's lot. All right? And he says, we can't contend. We can't argue with God about where he's made us, what purpose he's put us here for. He said, there are many things that increase vanity. How is man the better? So, again, sometimes we say things we shouldn't say about God, right? And he's making the argument here, we're a little bit impatient. Maybe we're doubting what is being said. So again, these words increase vanity. So we continue to struggle. Why, God? Why did I do all the right things and not be blessed? And so God is saying, and again, he's emphasizing, he says, how there are many things that increase in vanity. How is man the better? There's no reason. So again, think about this. He says, that life that's complaining to God about everything that goes on, and that's not going to yield any results either. A life of empty aims, a life of unfulfilled purposes. So part of the reason man's life is so vain could be because why? It's so short, right? Yeah. 60, 70, maybe 80 years. As the psalmist will say, 70, perhaps 80 years. If a person lives longer than that, then after a while, all their friends are gone. A lot of their family has died. And it's like, why did you leave me here to be here for all of this? You know? So it's so short. What does he say? He says, Verse 12, who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? Who can tell a man what will happen to him under the sun? So again, he doesn't have any future, and he looks at his life, and he realizes it passes by like a shadow. When we're little kids, we can't wait, as I said, for birthdays and Christmas. And it seems like it takes forever to get here. When we grow older, I'm still somewhat amazed that we're already in the third month of this 2018. And it just seems like day before yesterday, it was Christmas, you know. And if I had a brother here that attends South Cobb, he would say, I wish I could tell you that's going to get better, but it's not. It's just the way it is. So the thing is our lives are as a shadow. Our lives is something very vain. So we've got to make sure that we're doing what we can for God. Verse 11 is emphasizing kind of the conclusion of what he's talked about from chapter 7 through chapter 8. Man cannot really know what is good for him to do by himself, right? Now, again, if we look at things strictly from a under the sun kind of life, then we know that we can't really come to a conclusion about what life's all about. Now, God, inserting God back into the picture helps us to understand that we've got something beyond this life. So again, what's going to happen after these days? Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? Can any of us tell the future? I know that a lot of people think they can, but they can't. You know, some people try to look in vain throughout Scripture trying to find the answer to all their problems. And the problem is if you're not going to give yourself to the Lord and give him the glory that he deserves, you're going to be searching in vain. Some people look very hard to try to figure out exactly the day the Lord's coming again, premillennialists and all that ilk. And the bottom line is you know, what's going to happen after we're gone? Who will be an heir to inherit our property? What will they do with the money that we leave them, if we leave them anything? If we leave them a little bit of stuff, what are they going to do with it? You know, and again, we get to thinking, we rejoice in any inheritance that we might get. But as I've often said, the funerals or the fights start in the funeral home. And it just goes on and on and on. Will he have children to carry on his name? And again, we don't know all of that. We don't know all of that. We have to trust in God's government. And that's it. Here's the conclusion that he emphasizes. Number one, we can't know what is good for us to do. Number two, we can't know what's going to happen after we're gone. Right? Well, if that's the case, then what? Well, now we kind of get back to this idea of seriousness. The final verse of chapter 6 stated that no man knows for certain what is best or what's going to happen, right? So what are some things that we do need to do, all right? A good name is better than precious ointment than the day of death, rather than the day of one's birth. And this is one of those passages that emphasize we need to think better about death than we do birth. I've heard of some cultures actually weeping when babies are born because of the hard life they're going to have, but truly celebrating and rejoicing when somebody's passed from this earth. As for the child of God, what do you think should be our response, looking at it from what he's saying here in the book of Ecclesiastes, but also from everything we've studied thus far? Should we be weeping when babies come or crying whenever someone dies? Something to think about, isn't it? Right? Because think about those babies, they're going to have a lot to deal with and have to struggle with, right? So he says, good name is better than what? Precious ointment. It's better than that oil that is poured over a man to make him feel better. Perfumed oil back in those times was used a lot to overcome the odor of perspiration. We have perfume deodorants, but supposedly our deodorants are more odorant neutralizers as opposed to something to cover up the smell, right? Whenever you had feasts, you had weddings, there would be a lot of this oil spread around. Again, in a very arid, hot climate, you would have a lot of people sweating a lot. So I imagine the odor was very, well, you just put in a word. There was no air conditioner, none of the things that we enjoy today. So think about it in that respect. It was, yeah, it was odorous. That's right. There you go. There you go. And then he says the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Again, at birth, man has nothing before him but labor, trouble, uncertainty. He don't know what's going to happen. A rich man may lose everything he has. A poor man may become a king. You never know from one moment to the next. So that's it. At death, what? All of our anxieties are over. I have nothing more to worry about now. I'm gone. It doesn't matter anymore, right? The storms are all over as far as earthly values are concerned. So we are, in a sense, we're released from our misery then, right? Again, under the sun. Okay. And I want to keep emphasizing that idea, under the sun, because why? When you look at it without God's viewpoint, as when we look at it from God's viewpoint, we have something so much better waiting for us. All right, verses 2-4. It's good for us to mourn. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, or vexation, or grief. And by a sad countenance, the heart is made better, or pleasing. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Again, think about this, what he's trying to say. It's not that we need to be going to visit funeral homes and cemeteries all the time, though it doesn't hurt us to do that. Because that reminds us that we're all going to be there one of these days. I shared with you before, I worked at a funeral home for many years, various ones, and I think the thing that really hit home to me during those times was the fact that there's nobody promised tomorrow. And we need to be ready all the time. It just reinforced the things I've already believed about my relationship with God. But it also causes us to think about, I've buried babies. I've buried 19-year-old boys that were killed in automobile accidents. I've buried women that were in their 30s or 40s that were, I remember one situation that was killed by her husband. And you're sitting there thinking they still had life ahead of them, and they're younger than I am, and they've died. But it brings back the point, our life is as a vapor. It appears for a little time. So it is good to go to cemeteries. It is good to walk around like that, to remind all this stuff. Think about that. In the Jewish culture, the Jews were allowed to weep and mourn for 7 days after the burial of a near relative. And then they were allowed a lot of times to have a grief for up to a year. They could stay in grief. And then after that, they would then be kind of expected to kind of get back into society and do what they were doing before that person passed away. It is.
Some people do it naturally. I tried.
Right. That's right. And again, it really hits home in that respect. The house of feasting never really teaches us a whole lot, does it? Other than, enjoying those moments of selfishness and what we want, right? Revelry never betters a person. It never betters a person. So he's not saying here, this is not contradiction, what he has said back in chapter 2, verse 24, where he's emphasized the idea that a person should eat, drink, and find enjoyment. He says, no, he's not contradicting himself here, but he's talking about watching yourself when you go to the house of feasting, because sometimes you do things you wouldn't normally do. And sometimes you get to thinking that's what life is all about, feast to feast to feast to feast, and that's not it. You need to think about what? Death, right? The living take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter. What does he mean that? What is he talking about there? Well, again, as we think about it for a moment, he's emphasizing that if we think about our lives and I think about how short they are, then it may cause me to stop and think about my sins, and hopefully would cause me to repent. But when I'm laughing and enjoying myself, I'm not thinking too much about sin in my life or trying to get right with God. And again, is that not maybe something that happens in our culture a lot? A lot of people are trying to drown themselves in worldly pleasures because they don't want to think about tomorrow. They don't want to think about where their lives will end eventually. Isn't that sad? He said, by a sad countenance, the heart is made better. So it's better in that respect because it makes us think, right? It makes us think. It's made better. So it helps us to shape our character in that respect. It helps us to be better because, again, we think about, I don't know when I'm going to pass away. Now, it's not something we need to brood on, but it's one of those ideas that I don't know when I'm going to pass away. I need to be making sure that everything is in order when I do. So therefore what? The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of what? Mirth. So here you have, again, the choices. The wise are going to think about their deaths. The foolish are going to think always about fun, right? And so we are to use what God has given us because God has blessed us with these things in life. At the same time, we are to what? Always realize that one of these days, all that stuff's going to be gone.
What is the half on mirth?
Mirth is the same thing as partying. Joy, great deal of joy, where you're just living constantly in from one high to the next. Okay, and that's what he suggests there. All right. Here again, we talk about the idea, and forgive me for keep getting up and standing and all, but that chair is not too comfortable, and I'm wondering if it's going to last me. So anyway, the value of mourning. Now, verses 5 through 7, the value of rebuke. It's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This is vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debraces the heart. So, death, and thinking about death, causes us to stop and pause and think about our lives. In the same respect, sometimes when somebody calls me up and rebukes me for something I've done, I don't like it, but it may be the very best thing that I need. No one likes to hear rebuke. It's better, however, he says, to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. So, again, it comes from the Greek word, the Hebrew word here, Proverbs 13:7. A wise son hears his father instruction, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. And again, in chapter 17, verse 10, it's an admonition that's getting us on the right path. It's an admonition to encourage us to do what we need to do. All righty? So a lot of times people, what? They try to drown out the voice of wisdom by songs and the songs of fools. I think a lot about the ideal of drunken songs in the house of revelry. You know, I've never been in a bar, but I've seen some of the stuff on movies and stuff where they're all singing together. It's boisterous, reckless. They're drinking songs, all ungodly music, you know, all this stuff all along the line. And again, all this stuff is distracting us from the sound teaching that we need. It subverts our minds. It blinds us to the truth. And he says, how does he compare it? It's like crackling of thorns under a pot. Now, the crackling of thorns, I think the figure here, whenever you're boiling water or something like that and you have a big pot of water to boil, you don't throw thorns in the fire because they don't last. They're not going to put off that much heat. They'll crackle real quick and they're gone. So, and he said that's in essence what it is when you've got, instead of listening to rebuke, you're engaging in merriment and you're trying to drown out the voice of reason and revelation. And so it's it. So in the Hebrew here, there's a word play. Wood a lot of times was very scarce. And so a lot of times hay or stubble was used for fuel. Sometimes it would be thorns. And again, that stuff would burn very quickly, very hot, and then boom, it was just gone. It was in. And he says what? That's the way the sound of fools are. Songs of fools are. They're just that way. So how does a person become foolish? We listen to fools. We think about their laughter. We think about, well, they're having fun. We think about they're going towards selfish luxury. And again, trying to find all of the different ways to where we what? The unjust gain, the bribe, he says, debases the heart. So we look at all these things. And what it is he said it's not, what it does eventually, we become foolish because we're not thinking about what's being said. Secondly, once we resort to oppression, then what? Men often give acceptance to a bribery. A gift destroys the heart. I might have an enemy that brings me a gift, and I might look at him more favorably now that he's brought me the gift, but it could be something that's going to trap me eventually. So we have to be very, very careful about this kind of situation. Think about this gift sometimes deprives a person of understanding, wisdom. He's no better than a fool. He now what? Because whoever it is giving the gift, he's now what? Owes him, right? That's right. He owes him. He's going to talk now about impatience. Now, what is impatience? Restlessness. It's the opposite of patient, which means to endure or better or to bear up under something. And that's, again, what the ideal is brought out here. So he's going to talk a lot about impatience now. Verse 8. The end of the thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. The end is better because why? Then you have the right, you're able to form the right opinion about the matter. Whenever you go through whatever it is you're going through at that moment in time, we like to go through it and then sit and reflect about what have I learned? What have we learned? As elders, sometimes at South Cobb, we go through something and we're struggling with all this and we try to make the very best decisions we could under the circumstances. And then after it's all said and done, we sit down and talk amongst ourselves. What have we learned from this? What can we do better? What could we have done better in this whole situation? What should we have done? And, start making those lists. And again, sometimes those lists get real long and I just hope that I'm thinking enough to go back and look at the list so that I'll be ready the next time something happens. And think about that in that respect. A lot of times we don't think things through as well we should. We make a premature, improper judgment, and then we wind up regretting it. And I think, again, that's why he says, learn from it. Be patient. Bear up under it. Do what you've got to do. Make the best judgment you can under the circumstances, then what? Then you have to deal with whatever the consequences of that decision is. But also, hopefully, you might be able to foresee something that's going to happen that you can forestall happening a little bit later on. So there's a lot of wisdom here in that respect. Learn. Don't be proud. Don't get your back up. Be long of spirit rather than being short of spirit, being quick-tempered. Okay? True or false? A lot of people, when they are short-tempered, they say things they shouldn't. And remember, one of the qualifications of elders in 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus 1, is that he's not soon angry. So it takes him a while to get angry. You can be angry and sin not, right? But I have met people that they get angry at the drop of a hat. And he said that's usually will make you wind up regretting it before it was all over with. So think about that. Think about what you're going through. Don't be proud. Pride cannot sustain you through those hard times. Verse 9, do not be hasty in your spirit to be angry, for anger is rest in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. So a lot of times because we are angry, we say things, we do things we shouldn't do, right? And then we try to the best of our ability, if we're wise, to put this stuff out of our heart so that we could use it the way we need to. And then impatience sometimes leads us to negativity. We're negative all the time, right? The former days are better than these. The good old days, right? Right? And, I hear a lot about this. I hear a lot of people say this. Well, back in my day. Well, and that's okay to say it. We as seniors are to help those that are juniors to learn. That's a responsibility that God has given to all of us. But on another viewpoint is sometimes it's something that holds us back. That's not the way we did it years ago. Therefore, we can't change. The things that worked years ago in evangelism and building a church don't work now like they did then. Back in the 1940s and 1950s, after World War II, people would come back and they would teach the gospel. They'd have gospel meetings. People would be baptized. These things would go on literally sometimes for months. These things would go on, these gospel meetings, these what we call the brush arbors, and everybody was excited. But that was before the days of TV and even radio, a lot of situations. And people didn't have a whole lot to do other than that. And so they wanted to, that gave them an opportunity to hear the gospel. Now we say, okay, well, we need gospel meetings. Well, I'm one of those that believe firmly that we need to preach the gospel every chance we get. But they're not working like they did. Now we have to spend more time trying to encourage our own brethren to come. And so now all of a sudden, are we saying that preaching the gospel doesn't work? No. You still have to preach the gospel, but that way of doing it is not as effective as it once was. So years ago, we'd go out, have home Bible studies with people, and we would go door knocking. Now we're living in a culture today that when anybody comes to our door, we're not sure what's on the other side, and we've got our gun on this side because we're not sure who's knocking and what's it all about, right? So we, the church, we're suspicious of the folks and what they're going on behind that door. They're suspicious of us when we come to the door. Is that effective? Is that the best way to go and evangelize? I don't know that it is. But it beats what? It beats nothing, right? So we feel better about ourselves, and when we go door knocking, we'll sit back and say, well, nobody wants to hear the gospel anymore. I don't know that we need to be that way either, because that's just not the way they're used to handling that whole situation. Here's the thing. When we get older, we get stuck in our ways sometimes and think that's the only way that works. But we fail to take into consideration that culture has changed. At the same time, younger people are willing to jettison everything that the older people have learned and try everything new. And that's not the best way either. There needs to be balance. And in fact, Ira North would write that book about balance and how important it is that we be balanced. So, think about a lot of times in the Lord's church, we have become somewhat negative about a lot of things. We're quick to jump on people and judge people rather than give them the grace that God gives us. And we're not there to encourage and uplift them. So you see, then we finally all get down to the point to say, well, nothing's going to work. Why don't we just quit? And has that not been what happened in a lot of churches today? We've just quit. Yeah, we're having things, but people won't come. But then at the same time, it goes back to the idea of the gospel meetings that I was sharing with you a few minutes earlier. At the same time, there's something else involved there. You know, they're not willing to come because what are we teaching them? What are we saying to them? The church has got to find ways to get out into the community, and perhaps in service projects. For years, the South Cobb Church has sat there, and we've had gospel meetings and everything. Sometimes, like I said, can't even get our own members to come. In the last couple of years, we have purposefully tried to find ways to get. We had a job fair there. We had the American Red Cross there. We have had other things going on there. And recently, one of the members of the church walked into the Dollar General just around the corner, about less than half a mile, and said, "We need some poster cards." Well, what for? Well, we're part of this church down here, and we're going to put up some posters. And they said, "Oh, you're the ones that's really trying to get involved in the community now." And I'm sitting there thinking, you see, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. But we still have those in the church that are arguing, well, you shouldn't use the church building for this, or you shouldn't use the church building for that. There's that negativity. There's that negativism. That's not the way we've done it, so therefore what? And what the wise man is saying here, look, you do not inquire wisely concerning this. If you're sitting back saying the old ways are the best ways, no, you're not wise whenever you're saying that. We have to be willing to adapt. Let's take about a 7-minute break, come back at 7:30, and we'll begin again.
How you doing, brother?
Here again. We're back to the idea that he was talking about earlier of the value of practical wisdom. He's given us a lot of that value there. He's talked a lot about this ideal of impatience. And so here in verses 11 and 12, he emphasizes the idea that impatience is not compatible with wisdom. Wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun. Wisdom is a defense. Verse 12 emphasizes the idea it is a protective shade, you might say. It is a defense, as money is a defense, but the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. So he emphasizes the idea that you have to be willing to be patient enough to gain the wisdom necessary for what? For you to grow and to be what you need to be. Because wisdom is what? A defense. And again, the Hebrew word actually suggests the idea of a protective shade. Think, as I'm reading it, think a beach umbrella on the beach protecting you from the sun. And he says this is what wisdom is. Wisdom is that beach umbrella protecting you under the sun. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Wisdom gives life. Wisdom and wealth serve as protection in life, but wisdom is very much superior to wealth. We need more wisdom. Wealth can come and go. Riches can be gone in a heartbeat. But wisdom is something that's going to continue to help us to go and get back and try to start back again if we lose everything else in this world. So that's the emphasis that he emphasizes there. Wisdom gives life to those who have it. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? Anybody? No. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, consider that God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. We struggle with this a little bit because we think about the fact, does God give us bad times? And that brings us back to the idea of, is God accountable or God guilty because of the evil that's in the world? We say immediately, no, that started from Satan and the desire of man's choices. But if God is all good, then the question keeps popping up, why is there evil in the world? And we go back to Genesis 3 and talk about that as well. But again, can God stop the evil? Yes, he will one day. Why has he waited so long? And that brings us up to the next question. Well, why has he waited so long? And the only explanation I sometimes can give is because he wants all men to be saved. And his desire more than anything else is for mankind, the epitome of his creation, to be saved throughout eternity. So does God therefore appoint the days of evil as well as the days of good? Well, God knows them. God knows that if we make bad choices, we will have to suffer the consequences of those choices. So in one sense, God is appointing it because God has not and will not change it, because God is not going to change his will nor himself. So that, like I said, that gets us into a whole lot of ideas of free will. That gets us into a whole lot of another discussion on the Godhead. If God is all powerful, we get some of these absurd, stupid questions that people come up with. Can God create a rock so big he can't move? Well, that's just silly and crazy. Number one, why would God want to do something like that? And number two, no, he can't create something like that, because whenever you think about the fact he created the universe, sounds to me like he's created numerous rocks, but he's still in control of every last one of them. It's an absurd question, yet a question that some people look at as puts God on the horns of a dilemma. God is not under any circumstance to be. He's not in a dilemma whatsoever. He's God.
No, it would be an endless rock.
Right.
Because the universe is endless.
Right, and he is endless. So again, that's the idea. So in one sense, you will find that Job argues in the book of Job, and that's another discussion for another time in another class, that God was the one who punished him, but he did not really go back and see. It wasn't until toward the end of the book that he comes to the realization that God was not the one punishing him, but God was working things out, and that what Job needed to do was have faith that God was going to work everything out. And when we go through that today, we need to have faith that God is going to work all things out. He's going to right all wrongs, and he's going to get everything to the place that he wants it to be. How is he going to do that? He's God, I'm not. That's good. Because I couldn't even begin to understand it. So, the bottom line of what he's trying to make here is that when you get down to it, we are impatient about a lot of things. Impatient is just really is ineffective. It doesn't bring us to anything. We sometimes perplex ourselves about the mysteries of the universe. We should be concentrating on reflecting on God's will and how I can bring my life into conformity with that will. And that will be enough to keep me busy for the rest of my life. But again, we do worry about all these other things. How's God going to straighten out what happened in Nazi Germany and in Stalin's regime and some of these others, Pol Pot? How's God going to straighten out all of those deaths that were innocent lives? How's God going to straighten all that out? And you know what? I don't need to worry about that. God's going to straighten it out. He's going to make it right. Now, how he's going to do that, I do not know. So here's the thing. He says, we can't make straight what he has made crooked. We can't sit back and just be apathetic about it. Well, if God's not going to tell me how he's going to do it, then I just ain't going to do nothing. Well, that's not going to work either. The ideal is that we need to have patience, then realize that God will do it the way he wants to do it. And in the day of prosperity, I need to be joyful. In the day of adversity, I need to always consider that God has pointed one day as just the other. So, why? so that man will find out nothing that will come after him. In other words, he puts good and evil in men's lives according to laws that we don't know about. How could God set up the universe and everything that's in it and put all this stuff into motion? We know what we call the law of gravity. Albert Einstein talked the law about the law of energy, the various laws that we say, but do we as humans in our arrogance do we even have a clue about all the laws of God? Absolutely not. And we don't need to know. We need to learn to put our care on God. Let God handle these things. Remember what he said, 1 Peter 5, verse 7, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. So, I like what this one brother has said. One cheats himself of a day of joyous living by fretting about the past or worrying about the future. I like that. That's true. So if you want to live a joyous day, don't worry about the past and don't worry about the future. Just live today. Now, chapter 7, verses 15 through 18. The value of moderation. Okay. I have seen everything or all in my days of vanity. Now, again, hear that phrase, the days of vanity. So he's going to be looking at it strictly from his human viewpoint. He said, I've seen everything. Have you ever said, I've seen it all? Yeah. Well, maybe this is where we get that idea sometimes. I know that years ago, I used to say, I've seen it all. And I used to say, I've heard it all. And somebody says, well, what about now? I don't say that anymore because the moment I say that, I'm going to see something or hear something that's going to blow my mind again out of the water. So he says, here's some things that we really need to understand, okay? Righteousness has the promise of long life and prosperity, yet there are those that try to live righteous lives and they suffer death very quickly. The Hebrews expected, and not just Hebrews, but all people expect sinners to suffer and to die, right? And to die very quickly. And so here's one of the things that really struggle with this. He's struggling with this. Why is it that the righteous do what's right and sometimes still die quickly? There is a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs life in his wickedness. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. So a lot of people take this verse in verse 16 kind of out of context. Do not be overly righteous. And they say, well, that means you just don't be a goody two-shoes. You don't do what's right all the time. No, that's not what he's saying. He's talking about it from the perspective of under the sun, and he's looking at it from the viewpoint of what? He's talking about somebody that has really lived their life. Why is it? Are they going to be richly blessed here? Well, supposedly, but sometimes they die quickly, right? So what do? Excessive piety is not a means for securing a long and happy life. Is he emphasizing that we shouldn't be overly scrupulous in religious ritual? Is he saying that we can be so caught up in heavenly things that we're no earthly good? There's a lot of different things he could look at. Is it the judgmental Pharisaical spirit? Now, remember, there weren't Pharisees as he's writing this, but we know what we're talking about by that Pharisaical spirit. Is he condemning this Pharisaical spirit where this man is judging everybody else because they're not doing what's right? Sometimes we have those people that demand make such rigid demands that nobody's going to make it to heaven, right? That's what the Pharisees did, and their descendants are with us today. So it's not that He's condemning righteousness. It's the idea that that's what we're struggling with, is what exactly is he trying to say here? And I think he's emphasizing here the ideal of moderation. Not be partially wicked and partially righteous, but the ideal of what? Because you can get to the point where you could destroy yourself. When a person is overly righteous, when they are so worried about the letter of the law, then number one, they have no happiness, because they know in their own heart of hearts that they're not going to meet it. And they will always be judging everybody else by that same standard. So nobody, true or false, wants to be around them. True. So I think that's all that he's trying to emphasize as he's saying this. It's not, let's not take it out of context. See everything there, and again realize that, people die doing what's right. There's a wicked man who it seems like lives longer than anybody else in his wickedness. But you see, Judgment Day is going to make all that right. How? I don't know. That's God's call, not mine. Then that's what he goes on in verse 17. Do not be overly wicked. In other words, sometimes evil is the cause of a premature death. Young man goes out and gets drunk, gets behind the wheel of a car and kills himself. And again, he's done something wrong. Is he here sanctioning some sort of evil as long as it doesn't go beyond a certain limit? No, he's nowhere in the scriptures do you find anybody sanctioning any evil when you're looking at it from God's viewpoint, right? So he's saying here is, you don't cast off the restraints of the law. Don't sit back and think that sometimes we think that God is totally indifferent to sin. Why has God not punished America for all the unborn babies that have been killed? Why has God not punished America for the injustice that's out there? How long will it be before he does? If history shows us anything, nations that are sitting in prosperity fall very quickly when their morals go down the tube. And you think about the fact, 73 was the year the Roe versus Wade for the abortion situation. We've gone down the tube even morally more so since then. How long will God put up with that? I don't know. But I do know that God is a just God, and God will punish nations for their sins. So he says, why should you die before your time? He said, don't be overly wicked. It is good that you grasp this, he says. Grasp this, and don't remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. So there's the idea here. If you fear God, then you will escape the extreme of being overly righteous and overly wicked. You're trying to walk the way that God wants you to do. You're not going to go from one extreme to the other. Extremism is always a bad thing. You can go, as a brother told me years ago in school, International Bible College, he says, brethren, he says, stay in the middle of the road. He says, I've seen brethren get off on the right side of the road and get off in the ditch. And they stay there because they think that that's where God's truth is found, in that ditch on the right side of the road. And he said, I've seen brethren go from the right side of the road all the way over to the ditch in the left. They're overcorrecting. And they go to the left side of the road. But guess what? They're still in the ditch. He says, stay in the middle of the road. And I have always appreciated those words. And there have been times in my life when I've got a little bit too close to the right. And there have been some times in my life when I'm veering a little bit too far to the left. And I try my best. I beg people to help me to see that I'm staying right there in the middle of the road. And I think that's what he's trying to emphasize here. So wisdom teaches us self-restraint, but it also helps us in our struggle to master ourselves. 19 through 22. Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. There's not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. Do not take to heart everything people say. lest you hear your servant cursing you. For many times also your own heart is known that even you have cursed others. Boy, is that some words of wisdom there or what? Think about that. Number one, think about the ideal of sin. There is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. Nobody is perfect, is what he's saying. All right? He says, the wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. He's emphasizing here that you need to be wise. So the word 10 here suggests the ideal of completeness. So the idea is, if you're talking, when you've got problems, if you're talking among all these wise leaders, hopefully you'll come out and be victorious when the city is attacked. So again, think about that in that respect. God's wisdom is necessary. Sometimes you are going to realize that you're going to sin. So again, and what happens sometimes? Just people sin. Righteous people sin. And they beat themselves up. What caused me to do that? And they get to thinking, I can never do anything right. That's where God's grace comes in. Because if I get to thinking I have to do all this by myself, I may as well quit tonight and go home and just give up. But thank God for his grace. And sometimes the hardest people that we are on more than anything else are the people, we're hardest on ourselves. When God is willing to forgive us, when we're not willing to, as we would say, forgive ourselves. Right? So, you're going to hear people complain about you. All right? Don't take to heart everything people say. Boy, we do. You know, I could preach a great sermon, Brother Dale Jenkins brought this ideal out many years ago when I was listening to him preach, but it's so true. He said, I could be preaching before 600 people, and 599 of them can come up to me and tell me how great a sermon I've done and how I've done just a marvelous job. And one person is going to come up and say something too bad. And he says, I sit and stew on that one person that said something bad all week long. And that's the way we are. So don't take it to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant curse you. All right? You know, the servant would be acquainted with the master's faults, right? So the bottom line is you could have a relationship totally ruined by accidentally hearing what somebody says about you. It's happened so many times before. So don't try to overhear what everybody's saying, and, you know, don't take it to heart. Hard not to. We get our back up, right? But he said, don't do it. Don't do it. He said, I want you to think about this. You don't know in your own heart that you yourself have cursed others, right? You know that your heart, you have cursed others yourself. Don't do it. Don't do it. Okay? So, verses 23 through 29, he talks about, again, wisdom. Wisdom. All this I have proved or tested or all these have I tested by wisdom. I said I will be wise, but it was far from me. As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? I applied my heart to know, to search and seek out wisdom and the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and net, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. So he's really kind of beginning to conclude everything now. He's trying to get down to that point. He's going to come back to him over and over again. It's like he's saying it and says it again and says it again 2 or 3 different ways. And again, the reason is because if you don't hear it one way, I'll tell you in a way that you can understand. And I think that's wisdom. That's what preachers ought to be doing. We need to preach the truth, preach the truth, preach the truth. And that's what Jesus did. He did it in ways, using parables. He told them flat out sometimes what was going on. And sometimes he would use it just by his manner of life. He would be the example that he needed to be. So must we. in verses 23 and 24, he's emphasizing the idea of how hard it was to find wisdom. He desired to grow in wisdom, to use it to unfold mysteries, to explain problems, to deal with everything. But, it takes wisdom to search for wisdom, right? So he had been sitting there watching men's lives. He had watched the fool. He had watched the wise man. He had seen a lot of different things. He wished that he could know all the laws that were in control of a lot of things, but again, he couldn't. He says, so I'm making a very big trial of this. I proved it, but it was far from me. He said, I really wanted this wisdom, but it was far from me. And so he said, in essence, it's unsearchable. It's what? It's like that which is far off. It's deep. And the Marianas Trench in the Pacific Ocean is supposed to be the deepest place in the ocean. And he says, that's the way wisdom is. It's deeper than that. Deeper than knowing that. Here's what makes wisdom unattainable. All right? In the fact that there are a lot of questions of life that are far off. What is it like to die? I don't know. I've not been there. I've seen people die. And that's it. But, they're far off. Sometimes they're in the remote past. Sometimes they're far ahead in the future. Secondly, when there's some times where it seems like wisdom might be in our grasp, then I can't get it because my mind can't wrap my mind around it. Man is helpless before the infinite grace of the universe. Who can find it out? So he said, I applied my heart to know, to search, seek out wisdom, and with reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even the foolishness and madness. So that was the goal. That's what he was trying to do. He was trying to find these things. But he says, and I find more bitter than death. What? The result was the woman. Now, the woman. Again, there's a lot of questions here as to what the woman represents. In some places, it could represent folly. We remember in the book of Proverbs, you had the wise woman and Lady Wisdom, right? But then you also had the adulterous woman. And in some of those cases, the adulterous woman was not so much, but he got very graphic in some of those situations. It may not have been so much talking about a prostitute as much as it may have been talking about foolishness and folly. So could it be that he may very well have been referring to that? Could it be, again, that Solomon is referring to his wives that led his heart astray from God? 700 wives and 300 concubines. So, as I said, it could be his, number one, it could be any woman. Number two, it could be an evil woman. Number three, it could be the lady folly of Proverbs chapter 9, false philosophy, a worldly outlook. So again, the immoral woman is, as it was here, this woman as he's describing, I don't think it's an actual woman that he's talking about as much as it's a personification of foolishness. And he says, this foolishness is hard, it's snares and nets and hands or fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. So again, he's not making a condemnation of the female sex later on in verse 27, 28. Here's what I found, says the preacher, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason, which my soul still speaks that I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all of these I have not found. He's not condemning the feminine gender here as much as he's talking about the idea of what foolishness. And I really think that's what he's talking about here. God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. So, again, think about that. This is what I found. He's examined the character as it was of the loose woman, and he's put together fact after fact, and he found the final result, verse 27, 28. A woman among all these I have not found. And what's happening? He's disappointed. God made man upright, but man has what? Sought out of many schemes. God made man upright, but man has tried so many different ways to what? Get away from God. Okay? So, again, he revisits the ideal in chapter 8 of the authority of the king. Okay? Who's like a wise man who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his faith is changed. So, now wisdom is going to encourage obedience. I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. Where the word of a king is, there's power. And who may say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful. And a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. Because for every matter there's a time and judgment, though the misery of man increases greatly. He does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? No one has the power over the spirit to retain the spirit, and no one has power in the day of death. There is no release from that war. Wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. And this I've seen and applied my heart to every work that is done under the sun. There's a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt. So here's this old ideal of authority. Remember in Romans chapter 13, he will emphasize the idea that we are to obey those that have a rule over us. Here's this, you might say in essence, this idea here. So he says, what? Keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. It's interesting, and it's something that we need to emphasize in the Lord's church once again. We got to ask ourselves just how far we're willing to go with this. Are we supposed to obey every commandment of men when it comes to kings and those in authority? No, because in some situations, some of the laws made by men are unjust. We could talk about slavery in the United States for many, many years. We could talk about the right for a woman to get an abortion. That's wrong. It's just, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's wrong. It's sinful. So we know that, and we know, but sometimes we struggle with the idea of just how far are we to obey the rulers. Think about the Apostle Paul, who would obey and encouraged it, as well as Peter in the book of 1 Peter chapter 3, I think. He would emphasize that we are to obey the laws of the land. But again, we're reminded of Peter in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, we must obey God rather than men. When God's law always supersedes man's law, and therefore, if men commanded that they were not to preach anymore, then Peter says, no, we can't do that. We have to obey man's laws, or God's law. So it's interesting in that respect to really struggle with this whole thing, and I think that's where a lot of Christians really do struggle with it. Just how far does this go? Now, what happens more often than not in this matter is the fact that we get our opinions in it. And when our opinions come into it, then what? Then we try to find Bible passages that back our opinions up to justify what it is that we're not happy about. True or false? Yeah. So we've got to be very, very careful about this. Now, in this particular context, as he's writing here, he's again given some ideas. We've seen this in Proverbs, the idea of always obeying the king because God put that king in that place for that time. And again, I struggle with this somewhat. I've wrestled with this. How can God allow a government like Hitler's or Stalin's, which is atheistic? How can God allow that as we creep toward that or run toward that in this country? Just how far are we willing to go? What are we willing to do? Another thing that we could really discuss, and it's been discussed at Polishing the Pulpit, you can possibly look and find this out, but looking at Romans chapter 13 from a biblical viewpoint as well as this passage here, would there have been an American Revolution? Think about that for a few minutes. Would there have been an American Revolution? And again, what's also interesting about all of that is that many times, many of the preachers during those days would advocate for a revolution, that the king had overstepped his authority. Well, now, what would be overstepping his authority when he decides he's going to become God and not man? Okay, well, that means different things to different people, doesn't it? So he's emphasizing the idea. I think in this passage here, he's emphasizing the idea and trying to emphasize this idea of submission. And don't, he says, you keep the king's command. You do not be hasty to go from his presence. In other words, don't run, Civil government is ordained by God. The allegiance is owed to the king because of the oath before God. Now, under the Old Testament, this was a lot different than it is nowadays, because who put the king in place? Well, it was God who told Samuel to anoint Saul. It was God who told Samuel to anoint David. David then had the progression from there on. And going back to the promise of 2 Samuel 7, you shall not fail to have a king to sit on your throne, David. So there was that ideal of the kingly line of procession, son, the son, the son, the son, the son. So supposedly, and even before David died, there seemed to have been a coronation ceremony making Solomon king before David actually died, to pass on that power. So you can really argue that at that time, that was a kingdom that God had chosen, in that he chose the king himself. But again, that's as I said, that brings into so many other things there. When did it stop? Well, it stopped obviously when God allowed this people to go into captivity, right? Because of their sin, because those kings were not leading them in righteous ways. So there's a great principle there in that respect. Can we look at any senator, congressman, mayor, governor, president, and can we actually say that any of them have really led America in the paths of God? No. So again, our first allegiance is to God. And that, I think, was part of the reason why you might say that the colonialists argued that it was right and proper to rebel against King George. But again, he's emphasizing here, it's really something that is going to take something, it might be another quarter of study, looking at every passage that talks about kings and so forth there, and what's all going to be involved there, and what man's obligations are. But let's see what he's really trying to say here. He says, you keep the king's command because of the sake of your oath to God. So God is the one who put him there. Do not be hasty to go from the king's presence, and do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. So what does he mean? Do not, the king's word is powerful. And he says that's what he's emphasizing in verse 4. So he says, do not stand in an evil matter. This seems to suggest the idea, don't you join in a civil insurrection. Why? Because the king will do whatever pleases him. He had the power to deal with rebels very quickly, and he did it. Now, if the king is God, then you don't want to rebel against God, right? So there's that idea there. He says, then goes on, he says, there is power because of the word of the king. The subject may have right on his side, but the king wields power. He could do as he pleases because his mandate is all powerful. And who's going to say to him, what are you doing? Now, in America, we've had this privilege of saying, what are you doing? But again, it's becoming a situation where it's gone way. Here's my fear. This is opinion. but we have a culture in Obama. Find whoever gets elected. If it's a Democrat, then all the Republicans are going to be squealing and fussing and carrying on no matter what. If it's a Republican, then the Democrats just go the opposite extreme. So there's no rhyme nor reason to it all. And the thing is this: we we're never happy. And I think sometimes we're just one little footbit away from insurrection, from somebody taking guns and getting started on that. It's interesting. He's just really saying to him, under their kingdom, no citizen had the right to call the king into account. We do. Yeah. Because we actually make the argument that the king or the president is under law. But again, think about how often those laws are interpreted, misinterpreted, reinterpreted, twisted to make it say whatever we want it to say. So again, it's interesting. He says, this is especially true. If we look at God as being the king, who's going to say to God, what are you doing? That's a whole totally different matter, isn't it? And yet there are those even today that sit back and say, well, God owes me an explanation for things. No, he doesn't. You're just silly. That's all there is to it. So he says, he who keeps his commandment or his command will experience nothing harmful. And a wise man's heart discerns both the time and the judgment. So here's where wisdom comes in. Here again, wisdom comes in. Think about it in that respect. He says, because for every matter, there is a time and a judgment. God will judge everything that's been done. Though the misery of man increases greatly, he does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? We don't know when things are going to happen. We think about the fact in our country that the president, we want him to make the very best decisions he can with the information that he has. But again, he can't look into the future. He may hire a bunch of guys to sit around and talk to him and says, okay, if this regime does this, what should we do?
You know what it seems like here? It seems like you take the viewpoint. No matter what happens here. Mm-hmm. The bottom line, in the end, God will get the final say.
God will get the final say. Until that time, what are we supposed to do? Okay? Well, you abide by the king. If the king is ruling in a benevolent way and helping everybody, he's easy to follow. If the king is an autocrat, it's going to be my way or the highway, then what? The wise man will know how to bide his time and try to figure out ways to avoid those harsh restrictions that's going to come. He need not resort to violence to rectify the wrong for society because he knows that God will take care of that. So that's, again, it's another thing we need to be studying a lot more about, right? Because, again, you have so many different divergent opinions, even in the Lord's church. How far should I go with this? And 1 minute I'm ready to, I think we all are, because we get caught up in the heat of the moment. 1 minute we're ready to just fuss and fume and start something, and the next moment I'm sitting back saying, well, I can't do nothing about it anyway. I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. What do? Remember that we are part of his kingdom, God's kingdom. His kingdom is not of this world. There is going to be a whole better kingdom. His rule is going to be perfect. His rule is going to be totally benevolent. His rule is going to be everything that we can only possibly dream in our wildest dreams. And that's what we need to understand. All right, so he says, no one has the spirit or power over the spirit to retain the spirit. No one has power in the day of death. There is no release from that war, and wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. So again, he says, all this I've seen, and I applied my heart to every work that is done under the sun. There's a time which one man rules over another to his own hurt. Finally, he talks about this idea of death coming to all. As he's thinking about this from a perspective of strictly under the sun, what is he trying to say to us? He's trying to say, be wise enough to know how to handle the situations as they come up, right? Obey the laws, but bide your time if the laws are unjust. So, I saw the big wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. So here's the wicked buried, all righty? And the wicked were buried, and they had come and gone from the place of holiness. It seems like they had gone to worship, but they were forgotten. They were just, that was it. The sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. Therefore, it's in the heart of the sons of men to fully set them to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times, and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before the Lord. All of us are going to die. The wicked, it seems like, sometimes lasts longer than the righteous man, and that's true. The sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. As late as the 1930s and 1940s, and even in the 1950s in this country, when a man was found guilty of murder, he would and be sentenced to execution. He would be executed within 3 months of the sentence. Now, somebody has said that somebody can commit murder, he's going to be put in jail, and while he goes through all the 1,000,001 appeal processes, he would have lived longer in jail than he would have if he'd been out on the street. And again, there's something to be said about that in the fact that whenever a sentence needs to be made, it needs to be executed speedily. If I think I'm going to get away with it, then what's going to make me keep from doing it? Nothing. Are we there in that country? Are we there in this country right now? I think so. So again, he emphasizes that. His days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God, but it will not be well with the wicked. So again, he's looking past this time. He's got God in the picture. He knows that God will make all things right. God will punish the wicked in every sense of the term. And then finally, there's that delayed retribution. And then verses 14 and 15. So he says, there's vanity which occurs on earth. There are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. There are wicked men according to happens of the work of the righteous. In other words, it seems like wicked men are treated better than the righteous, and righteous men are treated worse than the wicked. And he says, so I commend enjoyment, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. That's the ideal of Epicureanism. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Right? That was a Greek philosophy, but it wasn't just a Greek philosophy. It was found among the Babylonians and the Persians as well. We just know it by its name, Epicureanism, because of the guy Epicurus, who was a Greek philosopher who actually advocated it. So he says, again, coming back to the conclusion, is nothing under the sun to eat, drink, and be merry, for this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. And when I applied my heart to know wisdom and see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day or night, then I saw all the work of God, that if man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, for though a man labors to discover it, he's not able to find it. You can't know everything there is to know. If we study the world and its universe for millions and billions of years, if God gives us that long, we cannot know all there is to know about how God created it and what God is doing. So here is We saw all the work of God. And he said, we can't undo it. He said, we discover it. We can't find it. A wise man attempts to know it. He'll be not able to find it. We cannot know all of the works and the purposes of God. We can't do it. All right. Next week, it's time to quit. So next week we will finish the book. Probably about an hour. I'm probably going to do it from home. And I will be giving a test to everybody. This next week, I'll send the test out from the midterm as well as that. The midterm is going to cover Proverbs. The final is going to cover Ecclesiastes. So just keep that in mind. Thank you guys for all your study and your being with me, and I appreciate you so much. Mark, have a good time. And
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.